In-laws humiliate single dad at family gathering unaware he saves them all. The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, and for a moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. 40 people stood frozen, watching a man in a plain gray suit kneel down to pick up the shards with his bare hands while a woman in a designer dress looked down at him like he was something she'd stepped in. "This is what happens," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "when you invite people who don't belong." Nobody in that room knew his name was Daniel Foster. Nobody knew that 6 years earlier, he'd made a decision that would determine whether every single person standing in that ballroom would be alive to see this party at all. Nobody knew that the man they were laughing at had once held the fate of a $200 million company and 300 jobs in his own 2 hands. They just saw a widower in a cheap suit, picking glass off the floor. Daniel didn't say a word. He just kept picking up the pieces, one by one, while his daughter watched from across the room with tears in her eyes and her small hands balled into fists. That moment, the humiliation, the silence, the shattered glass, was still 4 months away. To understand how it got there, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a rainy Tuesday in March, and an invitation Daniel almost didn't accept. Daniel Foster was 38 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you would never look twice. He wore the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation. He drove a 10-year-old Honda with a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped noticing it. He worked long hours at a job nobody at those family gatherings had ever bothered to ask him about, and he came home every night to make dinner for his 8-year-old daughter, Ellie, who was the entire center of his universe. 3 years earlier, Daniel's wife, Sarah, had died. It was sudden, an aneurysm, the doctor said, the kind that gives no warning and no mercy. One day she was helping Ellie with her spelling homework at the kitchen table, and 11 days later, Daniel was standing in a cemetery in a suit he'd bought 2 days before, holding his 5-year-old daughter's hand while she asked him when mommy was coming home. He never fully answered that question. He just held her tighter. In the 3 years since, Daniel had rebuilt his life around one single priority, Ellie. He'd taken a quieter job, one with predictable hours, so he could be home for dinner every night. He'd stopped going out. He'd stopped dating. He'd become, by every visible measure, an ordinary, tired, unremarkable single dad, the kind of man people's eyes slide past in a grocery store line. What almost nobody knew, what Daniel never mentioned, because it felt like a different lifetime, was that before Sarah died, before Ellie was born, Daniel had spent 9 years as a senior structural engineer, and later a risk consultant, for one of the largest commercial construction and infrastructure firms on the East Coast. He'd walked away from that career after Sarah's death, taking a modest position doing safety compliance reviews for a mid-sized firm, because it let him leave the office by 5. He didn't talk about his old life. It didn't come up. Nobody asked. Sarah's family, the Whitmores, had never quite forgiven Daniel for that career change. To them, it looked like failure. It looked like a man who'd had something and thrown it away. They didn't know, or didn't care to ask why. Sarah's mother, Margaret Whitmore, was the undisputed queen of that family. She'd built a real estate empire with her late husband, and she ran family gatherings the way she ran her open houses, with a practiced smile that could turn cold in half a second, and an unshakable belief that success was something you displayed, not something you quietly carried. Sarah's older sister, Denise, had married into money. Her husband, Preston, owned 3 car dealerships and never let anyone forget it. Denise had 2 things she loved most in the world: her son's private school accolades, and finding small, precise ways to remind Daniel that he had married up and then let the whole family down by wasting that opportunity. And then there was Preston himself, who had a particular talent for the kind of comment that sounded like a joke but wasn't. The kind that made a room laugh nervously while the person it was aimed at sat there absorbing it, alone. The family gathering that March was Margaret's 70th birthday, a lavish party at a rented event hall, with a live jazz trio and a seated dinner for 60. Daniel almost didn't go. He and Ellie hadn't been particularly close with the Whitmores since Sarah died. The invitations had grown thinner, more obligatory, over the years. But Ellie loved her grandmother, in the uncomplicated way that children love people who occasionally give them presents and remember their birthdays, and Daniel didn't want to be the reason she missed out on family. So he ironed his one good shirt, helped Ellie into her yellow dress, and drove the Honda with the check engine light to the event hall on the edge of downtown. He didn't know yet that this exact building, with its soaring glass atrium and its second-floor mezzanine and its underground parking structure, was the same building he had once flagged, in a report filed nearly 7 years earlier, for a structural retrofit that the original developer had quietly, cheaply, and dangerously skipped. He had no idea. Not yet. The party had barely started before the first small cut landed. Margaret greeted Daniel at the door with a hug that lasted exactly 1 second too short to be warm, and immediately turned her attention to Ellie, gushing over her dress, her hair, her manners, all real, all generous, before glancing back at Daniel's outfit with a flicker of something he'd learned to recognize a long time ago. "You didn't have to dress up," Margaret said, in a tone that made clear she meant the opposite. "It's your birthday, Margaret," Daniel said quietly. "Happy birthday." She patted his arm the way you'd pat a delivery driver who'd brought the wrong order, and moved on to greet the next guest. At dinner, Daniel and Ellie were seated near the end of the table, past Denise and Preston's family, past the cousins who worked in finance and the family friends who ran boutique law firms. Nobody made a scene about the seating. Nobody had to. It simply happened, the way these things always happened, quietly, officially, without a single person having to say out loud what everyone understood. Preston leaned back in his chair partway through the appetizer course, swirling his wine, and looked down the table at Daniel with the easy grin of a man who'd never once worried about money. "So, Dan," he said. He always called him Dan, never Daniel, a small thing that Daniel had stopped correcting years ago, still doing the, what is it, paperwork thing. "Compliance? Safety compliance review," Daniel said. "Yeah. Right. Preston nodded slowly, like he was being very generous by pretending to find this interesting. "Solid. Steady. Some people just aren't built for the big swings, I guess." "Nothing wrong with that." A couple of the cousins chuckled. Denise smiled into her wineglass. Ellie, sitting beside her father, looked up at him, not fully understanding the words but understanding, in the way children always understand, that something unkind had just happened to her dad. Daniel just nodded and reached over to cut Ellie's chicken into smaller pieces. "It's honest work," he said simply, and let it go. That was the first incident. It wouldn't be the last. The second came about 40 minutes later, during the toasts. Family members stood up one by one to say a few warm words about Margaret, her generosity, her business sense, her devotion to her grandchildren. When Denise stood up, she spent most of her toast talking about her own son's acceptance into a prestigious summer program, working it in as though it were somehow relevant to her mother's birthday, before finally circling back with, "And Mom, thank you for teaching all of us that you build something real through ambition. Through actually striving for more." Not everyone in this family got that lesson. She paused just long enough, glancing almost imperceptibly toward Daniel's end of the table, "But the ones who did, we owe you everything." The table laughed, a little uncomfortable, a little complicit. Daniel felt his ears go hot. He kept his eyes on Ellie's plate, cutting another piece of chicken that didn't need cutting, just to have something to do with his hands. Beside him, an older woman named Ruth, Margaret's cousin, a quiet widow who'd been seated near Daniel likely for the same unspoken reason he had reached over and gently squeezed his forearm under the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. It was the kind of small kindness that meant more than anyone at that table would ever know. Ruth had been the target of her own quiet cruelties that night. Denise had forgotten to introduce her to a new family friend twice, and Preston had made a comment about her modest cardigan that had gotten an easy laugh. Ruth had spent most of the dinner smiling politely and saying very little, the practiced posture of someone who had absorbed this treatment for years and simply stopped expecting better. At one point, when a caterer accidentally bumped Ruth's chair and nearly spilled water on her dress, Denise said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Careful, I don't think Ruth's dry cleaning budget covers emergencies," and laughed at her own joke while Ruth's smile tightened at the corners, her eyes dropping to her lap. Daniel watched that moment happen, watched Ruth absorb it the way he'd learned to absorb his own, and something in his chest went quiet and still. He leaned over, refilled her water glass himself, and said, low enough that only she could hear, "You didn't deserve that." Ruth looked at him, surprised, like it had been a long time since anyone had said something so simple to her. "Neither do you," she said back. It was such a small exchange. Nobody else at the table even noticed it happened. But it was the gut punch moment that told the viewer, told anyone paying attention, exactly what kind of people they were dealing with, and exactly what kind of man Daniel Foster actually was underneath the gray suit and the quiet nodding. The third incident came near the end of the night, and it was the one that mattered most, even though almost nobody clocked it at the time. Margaret had hired an event planner for the party, a nervous young woman named Priya who'd clearly been given an impossible budget and an even more impossible client. At one point, Priya approached Margaret with a folder, quietly mentioning that the building's facilities manager had flagged something about the mezzanine level, a maintenance note about the load capacity for the upper section, where Margaret had wanted to set up a dessert and gift table for photos. Margaret waved her off without even looking up from her champagne. "It's a party, not a construction site. Just put a folding table wherever's cute. I didn't pay this much money to hear about paperwork." Priya hesitated, glanced around, and her eyes landed, for just a second, on Daniel, sitting quietly at the end of the table. She didn't know who he was. She had no reason to think a man in a plain gray suit, seated at the least important end of the table, could possibly be useful to her. So she just nodded, apologized to Margaret, and went to set up the folding table on the mezzanine like she was told. Daniel noticed. He always noticed things like that. It was a habit from a career he'd left behind, a habit of quietly, automatically scanning a room, a building, a structure, and cataloging what needed attention. He glanced up at the mezzanine rail, the way it had been retrofitted, the slight give in the flooring near the north support beam that his eyes caught almost without meaning to. Something in the back of his mind flagged it as familiar in an uncomfortable way, but he pushed the thought aside. It wasn't his business. Not tonight. Tonight he was just a dad at a birthday party, trying to get through the evening without making a scene. That was clue number 1, dropped so quietly most viewers wouldn't even register it as a clue yet. The fourth incident, the one that finally cracked something open in Daniel, came almost at the very end of the night, and it involved Ellie. The kids had been let loose to run around near the dessert table on the ground floor while the adults mingled with coffee and cake. Ellie, in her yellow dress, had gotten a little too enthusiastic, reaching for a cupcake and bumped the corner of the table, sending an elaborate glass centerpiece rocking. It didn't fall. It didn't break. But Denise's son, Tyler, sitting nearby, immediately said loudly, "Watch it." God, some people just don't teach their kids manners. Denise, overhearing, didn't correct her son. She just looked over at Ellie, then at Daniel, and said with a thin smile, "It's fine. It's hard doing this alone. Nobody's really keeping her in line, is all." The comment landed like a slap. Not at Daniel this time, at Ellie. At his daughter, who was standing there red-faced and near tears over an accident that hadn't even caused any damage. Daniel crossed the room in about 4 steps. He crouched down in front of Ellie, gently turned her face toward his, ignoring the room completely. "Hey. Look at me. You didn't do anything wrong. Accidents happen. Okay?" Ellie nodded, sniffling, and he pulled her into a hug, holding her there a beat longer than necessary, mostly to give himself a second to breathe before he said something he'd regret. When he stood back up, he looked at Denise, not angry, not raising his voice, just steady. "She's 8. She's allowed to bump a table." And then, quieter, just for a second, something harder passed behind his eyes. "Careful how you talk about my daughter." Denise blinked, clearly not used to Daniel pushing back on anything. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. That was the moment, small, contained, quickly smoothed over by Margaret calling everyone back for cake, where the tension in the story crested for the first time. It wasn't the big reveal. Not yet. But it was the moment the audience understood, this quiet man had a limit. And they were getting close to it. The months between that birthday party and the second gathering weren't dramatic. Daniel kept working, kept picking Ellie up from school, kept coaching her through spelling tests at the same kitchen table Sarah used to sit at. He didn't think much more about the Whitmore's comments. He was used to it. He'd built a kind of armor over 3 years of quiet grief and quiet dismissal, and mostly, it worked. But something had shifted after that comment about Ellie. Daniel found himself, a few days later, pulling up an old email account he hadn't opened in nearly 2 years, one tied to his former professional life. He wasn't sure why. Curiosity, maybe. Or something closer to reckoning. Buried in that account was a report he'd authored 7 years earlier, a structural risk assessment for a mixed-use commercial development downtown. He remembered it clearly now, a mezzanine-level renovation, a developer who'd pushed back hard on the retrofit costs, a compliance case that had eventually gone to arbitration after Daniel refused to sign off on the cheaper version of the plans. He'd walked away from that firm not long after, when Sarah got sick the first time, before the aneurysm, a health scare that turned out to be nothing, but had made him re-evaluate everything. He'd left the report behind, unfinished business he'd never followed up on, assuming someone else had eventually resolved it. He hadn't thought about that building in years. Until he stood in its atrium at Margaret's birthday party and felt that flicker of unease looking up at the mezzanine rail. He told himself it was nothing. Buildings get inspected. Codes get enforced. Someone would have caught it by now. He was wrong. The next family gathering came 4 months later, Denise's 20th wedding anniversary, hosted, at Margaret's insistence, in the exact same event hall, because Margaret had gotten such a good rate and loved the venue's atrium. Daniel almost didn't go. Ellie begged him. She loved her cousins, even the ones who weren't especially kind to her, in the way children forgive faster than they should. So Daniel put on the same gray suit and drove the same rattling Honda downtown. The evening started the way these evenings always started, polite distance, thin smiles, a seat near the end of the table. Daniel had made his peace with it. He wasn't there for the Whitmores. He was there for Ellie, and for the 2 hours of cake and dancing that would make her happy. It was around 8:30, during the cocktail hour before the seated dinner, that Priya, the same event planner from Margaret's party, now working Denise's anniversary too, approached Margaret again, visibly more anxious this time. Mrs. Whitmore, the building manager, left a message. There's an inspection notice on the mezzanine level from a few months back that never got Priya. Margaret's voice had an edge to it now, sharper than before. I swear, if you bring me one more piece of paperwork tonight, I will find someone else for next year. Just keep people off that side if it makes you feel better and let it go. Daniel, standing near the edge of the room with a glass of water he wasn't really drinking, caught the exchange. His stomach tightened. An inspection notice. On the mezzanine. Months after the party where he'd noticed that slight given the flooring. He told himself again, not his business. He was a guest here. A quiet, unwelcome guest, but a guest. But then he watched Priya walk away, defeated, toward the mezzanine stairs where Denise had specifically requested the anniversary champagne toast and photo moment happen, because it photographed beautifully with the atrium lights behind it. Waiters were already carrying trays of champagne flutes up those stairs. Nearly the entire family, 60 guests, would be gathered up there within the hour. Daniel set down his water glass and walked toward the stairs. He found the building's maintenance access panel near the base of the mezzanine stairwell, a habit of his old job, always knowing where the access points were, and used his phone flashlight to look at the support structure beneath the overhang. What he saw made his chest go cold. The retrofit he'd specified 7 years ago had never been done. Not properly. Someone had patched it, cosmetically, cheaply enough to pass a cursory glance, but the actual load-bearing correction he'd flagged was still missing. And now, above him, 60 people were about to gather on a mezzanine level that had been slowly, invisibly failing for years under where it was never rated to hold. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight up those stairs, past waiters and guests already migrating toward the space for photos, and found the building's facilities manager, a heavy-set man named Gary who was hovering nervously near the buffet, clearly the same person who'd left that inspection message. I need you to clear this level right now, Daniel said, his voice low but absolutely certain, a tone nobody at any family gathering had ever heard him use. Gary blinked at him. Sir, this is a private event, I can't just. I used to do structural risk assessment for buildings exactly like this one, Daniel said. I filed the original retrofit report on this mezzanine 7 years ago. It was never completed. That inspection notice you left for the Whitmores tonight, I'd bet everything I have that it says the same thing. You need to clear this floor now, and you need to call your structural engineer tonight, not next week." Something in Daniel's voice, the specificity, the certainty, the complete absence of hesitation, cut through Gary's skepticism in a way that no panic or shouting ever could have. Gary's face went pale. I flagged it. Nobody would authorize the closure, the owner didn't want to lose the booking fee, and clear it. Now. At that exact moment, right on cue, right as nearly the entire Whitmore family and their guests were clustered together near the north rail for Denise and Preston's anniversary toast, there was a sound, a low groan of metal and stress that most people in the room mistook for the band's bass amp. But Daniel heard it for exactly what it was. "Move," he shouted, already moving, already grabbing the nearest person, Ruth, standing closest to the rail, her champagne glass raised for the toast, and pulling her bodily away from the edge just as a section of the mezzanine flooring along the north support dropped nearly 2 inches with a sickening crack, the railing shuddering violently. Screaming erupted. Champagne glasses shattered across the floor. Guests scrambled backward in a chaotic crush away from the north side, Daniel's voice cutting through the panic. "Everyone to the stairs, calmly, now, stay away from the north rail," with the kind of authority that made people simply obey without questioning why a man in a gray suit was suddenly directing 60 terrified people to safety. Within 90 seconds, the mezzanine level was clear. The floor held, barely. It didn't collapse. But it had dropped, visibly, dangerously, exactly where Daniel had said it would. That was the shattered champagne glass. That was the moment from the cold open, except now the audience understood what the woman in the designer dress, Denise, hadn't understood in that first Frozen scene. Daniel hadn't caused a scene by being clumsy or inappropriate. He had just saved every single person on that mezzanine, and the humiliation the audience witnessed in the opening was about to happen in the minutes right after this, when nobody yet believed him. In the chaos afterward, as people gathered on the ground floor, shaken and confused, Margaret rounded on Daniel with fury instead of gratitude, the particular fury of someone whose expensive, image-perfect party had just been ruined. "What did you do?" she demanded. "You caused a panic over nothing, you scared everyone, Margaret," Daniel said quietly. "The floor dropped 2 inches. Look at it yourself. It's an old building, things settle, you didn't need to start screaming and grabbing people like a lunatic." It was in that moment, cameras out, guests recording on their phones out of instinct, Priya standing frozen nearby, Gary the facilities manager pale and silent by the stairwell, that Denise, still furious, still not understanding, knocked into a waiter's tray in her agitation, sending a champagne glass shattering onto the marble floor. And it was Daniel, calm, steady, already down on one knee clearing the glass before anyone hurt themselves on it, the same instinct that had made him grab Ruth off that rail seconds earlier, who knelt down without a word to clean it up. "This is what happens," Denise snapped, humiliated and looking for somewhere to aim it, "when you invite people who don't belong." The cold open, closing the loop. But this time, the story kept going. Gary the facilities manager cleared his throat behind them, holding his phone, his face still ash white. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice shaking, "I just got off the phone with the city inspector's office. They're sending someone tonight. That inspection notice I left you, it's the same finding this gentleman just described. Word for word. The load-bearing retrofit on the north mezzanine support was never completed. It's been outstanding for 7 years." The room went quiet. 7 years, Preston repeated slowly, looking at Daniel now with something entirely different in his expression. Daniel stood up slowly, the broken glass gathered carefully in a napkin in his hand. "I filed that original report," he said. "A long time ago. Before I left engineering. I recognized the flooring tonight the moment I looked at it. I've been trying to tell myself it wasn't my problem anymore." He looked around at the room, at 60 stunned faces, at Ellie standing near the door with Ruth's protective hand on her shoulder, having watched her father just save an entire party of people who spent all night making him small. "It was my problem the second I saw children standing on that floor." Margaret's face had gone through several emotions in rapid succession: anger, confusion, and now, slowly, dawning horror at what had almost happened, and at what she just said to the man who prevented it. You were an engineer," she said, quieter now. "Structural risk consultant." 9 years, Daniel said. "I stopped after Sarah passed. I needed a job that let me be home for Ellie at 5 o'clock every day. I never made a big deal out of it because it never mattered to anyone here what I used to do. Only what I do now. Denise, still holding the fragile edges of her ruined anniversary party, opened her mouth like she wanted to salvage something, some version of dignity. You could have just told us calmly instead of shouting. There were 60 people standing on a compromised floor, Denise, Daniel said, and for the first time that night, there was an edge in his voice that didn't apologize for itself. There wasn't time to be calm about it. Nobody had a response to that. It was Ruth who broke the silence, walking over and taking Daniel's arm gently, the same way she had at Margaret's birthday party months earlier, except this time it wasn't a private, quiet kindness, it was in front of everyone. He just saved my life, she said simply, to the whole room. All of your lives. I think that's worth remembering, the next time somebody wants to make a joke about him. Preston, to his credit, was the first to actually apologize, in his own clumsy way. He walked over, hand extended, his usual easy grin gone. Daniel, he corrected himself. I owe you an apology. A lot of them, probably. I had no idea. You didn't ask, Daniel said, shaking his hand anyway, because he wasn't a man who held grudges for sport. Nobody really did. The city inspector arrived within the hour, along with a structural engineer on emergency call, and confirmed everything Daniel had said. The north mezzanine support had been failing for years, patched over cosmetically by a previous contractor cutting corners, exactly the outstanding issue from his 7-year-old report. If the section had gone another 20 minutes without intervention, with the full weight of the toast crowd gathered along that rail, the engineer said quietly to Margaret, the collapse could have been catastrophic. Not an injury. A tragedy, with children in that room. Margaret sat down hard in a chair near the entrance, the full weight of what had almost happened finally landing on her all at once. When she looked up at Daniel again, there was nothing sharp left in her expression at all. I have spent 3 years, she said slowly, treating you like you were lucky to be part of this family. And you just saved every single person in it. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't lecture her, either. He just nodded, tired, and said, I didn't do it to be forgiven for anything, Margaret. I did it because Ellie was standing 20 feet from that rail. That landed harder than anything else that night. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at the anniversary party made its way, in pieces, through the wider family, not as gossip exactly, but as something closer to reckoning. The building's owner, facing serious liability exposure and a furious city inspector's office, quietly settled with the venue and finally authorized the full retrofit, 7 years late. Daniel gave a full statement to the inspector's office, his old professional records confirming everything, and though he never asked for credit, Gary, the facilities manager, made sure the story got told accurately. A guest at a party had noticed what 3 separate contractors and 1 negligent building owner had missed or ignored for years, and it had saved 60 lives. Daniel didn't return to structural engineering full-time. That wasn't the point of this story, and it wasn't what he wanted. He still picked Ellie up every day at 5. He still made her dinner, still sat with her at the same kitchen table doing spelling homework. But he did agree, a few weeks later, to a part-time consulting retainer with the city's building safety division, reviewing exactly the kind of overlooked, deprioritized structural reports that had almost gotten an entire wedding anniversary party killed. It was work he could do 2 evenings a week after Ellie was in bed, and work that mattered in a way that felt, for the first time in years, like it fit both halves of who he was, the quiet father, and the man underneath who had once been very good at seeing danger before anyone else could. Margaret changed, too, in the specific, imperfect way real people change, not overnight, not completely, but visibly. She started asking Daniel questions at family dinners instead of past him. She stopped seating him at the end of the table. When she introduced him to new acquaintances now, she didn't say my son-in-law with that faint apologetic edge. She said, this is Daniel. He saved this whole family's life once, and he still shows up every day to make his daughter's lunch. It wasn't perfect. Old habits took time to fully unlearn, and Margaret still occasionally slipped into her old sharpness about other things. But the contempt was gone, replaced by something that looked, slowly, like respect. Denise took longer. She never fully apologized for the comment about Ellie, the one that had actually been the deepest cut of the whole story, the one Daniel cared about far more than any insult aimed at himself. But about 2 months later, at a smaller family dinner, Daniel watched her correct her son gently when Tyler made an offhand comment about another kid's second-hand backpack at school. That's not kind, and it's not who we are, and he recognized, watching it, some quiet internal shift happening in her too, even if she never said his name in connection with it. He decided that was enough. Not every wrong gets a formal apology. Sometimes it just gets a slow, private correction, and you let people have that. Preston, for his part, became something closer to an actual friend. He started asking Daniel real questions about his old career, genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity for an audience, and a few months later quietly connected him with a former colleague who did structural consulting for his dealership expansions, work Daniel took on the side, at his own pace, on his own terms. Priya, the event planner who'd been dismissed and ignored all night, got something too. Daniel made a point, in his statement to the building owner's insurance investigators, of noting clearly that Priya had flagged the safety concern twice and had been overruled both times by the client. It cleared her of any liability concerns that could have followed her professionally, and Margaret, in a moment of genuine grace neither expected of herself, personally recommended Priya for 3 other events that year, telling anyone who asked that she was the only person who tried to do this right. And Ruth, quiet, gently mistreated Ruth, who had squeezed Daniel's arm under the table at that first birthday party, became something like a permanent fixture at Daniel and Ellie's kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, an unofficial grandmother figure who Ellie adored completely, and who Daniel came to rely on more than he expected. Sometimes the smallest kindness in a story is the one that grows into the most. The final family gathering that year was smaller, just immediate family, at Margaret's house instead of a rented hall, for Ellie's 9th birthday in the fall. Daniel stood in the kitchen helping Margaret cut the cake, something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, while Ellie ran around the backyard with her cousins, laughing, completely unaware of how close that laughter had come to never happening again. Margaret glanced over at him while he carefully sliced the cake into even pieces. "You know," she said, "you could have let us keep thinking you were nothing. After everything we said to you. You could have let that mezzanine floor be somebody else's problem to notice, that night. Nobody would have blamed you." Daniel thought about that for a moment, watching Ellie through the window, safe, laughing, alive. "I thought about it," he admitted honestly. "For about half a second. But that's not really a choice, when it comes down to it. You don't get to decide who deserves to be safe based on how they treated you." Margaret didn't have anything clever to say back to that. She just nodded, and for once, let the silence between them be a comfortable one. Daniel Foster never set out to prove anybody wrong. He never wanted credit, never wanted the family who'd underestimated him to feel small the way they'd made him feel small for years. All he ever wanted was ordinary things, dinner with his daughter, a quiet life, a chance to grieve his wife without an audience judging how he did it. But sometimes the measure of a person isn't found in the moments when everyone's watching and applauding. It's found in the moment nobody expects anything from you at all, and you choose to show up anyway. Daniel had spent years being underestimated by people who mistook quiet for empty, and gentleness for weakness. In the end, it wasn't the title he used to hold, or the money he never had, that mattered. It was the simple, unglamorous truth that some of the strongest people in the room are the ones nobody bothers to look at twice, and the world is safer and kinder because they show up anyway.